Hi, writer. Want my support to get your book finished and out into the world? Join my Inner Circle membership, a community of supportive writers where each month we set goals, share pages, learn new techniques, and get you unstuck fast so that you can make continuous progress on your writing goals. Coached Writers Finish. And you can get me as your virtual book coach in this group program for only $199 a month, much less than a single one-on-one coaching session. Check out the details at suzyvidori.com/inner circle. We have live events happening all the time, so grab your spot now to join us. Welcome to the Show Don't Tell Writing Podcast with me, Suzy Vidori, where I peel back the layers of how to wow your readers with your fiction, your nonfiction. Anybody can bang out a first draft, but it takes a little more work to make your book as amazing as it can be. Join me as I share the step-by-step writing techniques you could apply to your writing right away, as I host successful writers who share a behind-the-scenes look at their own writing lives, and as I live coach writers on their pages, giving practical writing examples that will make your own writing stronger. Nobody is born knowing how to write an engaging book. There are real and important skills that you need to learn. On this show, I cut through the noise and get you all the info you need. I can't wait to see how this information is going to transform your writing. Welcome to the podcast, Show Don't Tell podcast today. Emily Colin. I am so excited to be here in Denver with her at a book coaching conference. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and to talk about romance, which is one of my very favorite things in the world to talk about. So thanks for having me.
Oh my goodness. Me too. Okay, so for our listeners, we have a lot of newer writers. We have writers from all different genres. So before we even get started, can you define what you mean by capital R romance books?
Absolutely. So there are plenty of genres that incorporate romantic elements. Just because you have a romantic storyline in your book doesn't make it a romance. I think there are two really big litmus tests that you can do to determine if you are writing a romance. The first one is, does it end in what we in the romance genre call an HEA, but that stands for happily ever after, or HFN, which is happily for now. If your book ends tragically, where the lovers don't get together, something goes horribly wrong, it can still be a beautiful, wonderful, amazing, incredible book and a romance. The other thing that you can do to tell if you're writing a romance is if you take out the romantic plot. If, for example, you could leave the characters in, but they're just friends. If you remove the romantic plot from the story, does the story still work? Because there are plenty of genres. Let's just take romantasy as an example. There's a distinction between romantasy and romantic fantasy. And so the distinction is that in romantasy, the fantasy plot and the romance plot are equally important, and they are intertwined. Think about, like, I don't know, one of those old trees with ivy growing all around it. Like, you can't really tell the difference. They're growing together. But in romantic fantasy, you have a situation where the fantasy is the main plot, and you may well have a love story, but it's not, oh God, the thrust of the story, forgive me. And if you pull it out, the storyline will still work. So those are the two. Do you have an HEA or HFN? Now you guys know what that means. We did before. And will the storyline work if you pull out the romance? And if the answer to those questions is no, then you're not writing a story with romantic elements to it, but you're not writing.
Yeah, and that's so helpful. And, I work with a lot of writers who initially think, or they think that they'll just say, I'm writing a fantasy romance, but really they're writing a fantasy with romantic element, right? And not and that's why I say capital R romance versus just a romance plot line. Why is that important? Why should writers listening actually care what they call it? Because it's actually important.
It is really important. And it's important for a couple of reasons. So one reason I'm going to give you is entirely practical. And then the other one that I'm going to give you is a little bit more squishy, but also practical. So the practical reason I'm going to give you is whether you're an indie author, meaning that you're self-publishing your books, or whether you're choosing to go the traditional way, track, we say sometimes, that's just easier to say, where you're getting an agent, perhaps you're going with a big five or smaller traditional press. There are certain genre expectations, and you need to know what your comparable titles are, your comps are. And this is because your agent or editor needs to know, who would your book shelf buddies be? Who would his friends be? where does this book fit in the market? Now, we're not talking about quality. You want your book to be universal enough that it's recognizable next to the others, but have something different and not to make it stand apart, right?
Yeah, your book is going to be your book. It's going to be unique in your voice, but there are certain elements that readers, like that publishing expects, yes, and also that readers expect. And if you don't match that, they might pan your book even if it's awesome because you called it something and they had an expectation and then they're stuck. Right.
Yeah. And so that's the squishy part I was going to say. So I'm going to give you an example from myself, something I would never do again, but I didn't realize. This is when I was a little baby author. So my very first book came out in 2012, and it was billed as a romance then. I think now we would think of it as like book club fiction with very strong romantic elements.
Yeah.
But I wasn't thinking of it by the time the second book came out as a romance. I was thinking of it as what I just described. But my readers were primed to expect a romance. In book of fiction, you followed the emotional arc of the people whose stories you are following, right? You're following the emotional arc rather than necessarily does this couple get together. So in my second book, that's what I did. I followed the emotional arc of the female main character, and spoiler alert, but it came out a long time ago. It made more sense for her to wind up with not necessarily who we thought in the beginning. Man, the hate for that.
Wow.
So I didn't realize, right? I thought, okay, well, this is book club fiction, but my readers were primed for one, it was not a series, to expect a romance. And so they were so disappointed because they thought, well, of course, this is where this is going. And so that's the squishy pink part that I'm talking about, is like, more than anything else, you pick up a thriller, you're expecting it to be fast-paced with short sentences. You pick up sci-fi, maybe it's in space or maybe there's aliens. It's the same with romance readers. And actually, romance readers are among the most discriminating, and they tend to read in series and consume a lot of books very quickly. And so because of that, they are exquisitely attuned to the genre. And so if you fail to meet those expectations, then I mean all subgenres of romance too, like, whether it's romantic suspense or it's cowboy romance or it's sci-fi romance or it's romantasy, they're going to be really let down. And the one thing you never, ever, ever want to do is break the contract between reader and writer. And that is where everything starts to go really awry. So that is why you really want to know your genre, because more than anything else, we're doing this because we're writing stories that we want readers to love. And if we set ourselves up in a story structure to let them down, then that is the very opposite of what we're trying to do as writers. And that's why it's so important to be clear in those.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you talked about subgenres and knowing whether or not, if you promise a romance, it better be a romance. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But also, I think level of spice. And readers like what they like. We just talked about the fact that romance readers are some of the most avid readers out there. They tend to read quickly. They tend to read a lot in series, as you said. So they are a market that is ripe for your book, but you've got to find the right ones, because you don't want to get a 1-star review because you didn't meet expectations, even if your book might be excellent, women's fiction or something different. But if you bill it as a romance reader picks it up, as Emily said, they're very discerning and they will rock you, right? They will rock you. Okay, so yeah, so I talked about spice level a little bit as well. Can you just run that down? And then I want to talk about this misconception that the podcast is talking about. But in terms of spice level as well, there's a contract with your reader and what they're expecting. And there's everywhere from sweet romance to very explicit and anywhere in between. And what does that look like in terms of?
Yeah, I think sometimes people get so anxious about writing the sexy scenes in their novels because they just imagine their mother looking over their shoulder, right? Or even worse, their grandma looking over their shoulder.
Or their kids.
And so one thing that I always try to say to people is that the intimate scenes that you're writing in your novel should be an extension of the character development. They should always move the character development forward, and they should always move the plot forward. In that sense, they're just like every other scene. But because intimacy is so, obviously intimate, it tells us so much. You're going to learn a lot more about how two people come together that way than you might necessarily know how to take their eggs, right? So I think that because of this, you have to really think about what is the quote unquote spice level that is appropriate for more stories. Sometimes people think, oh no, I need to put full door erotica in my book, or it can't be
bodice ripping. Yeah.
And they're not comfortable with that, but that's what they think they need to do to sell. Or sometimes people think, I'm really not comfortable with that. I know that about myself. So I'm going to write this is what we call closed door, where we don't actually get to go into the bedroom with the couple. Then they think, well, no one's going to want to read that. And so I think it's really important to say that there is a market for every quote unquote spice level in romance. There's a market for sweet romance. There's a market for closed door and fade to black. There's a market for sensual romance where you get to see them within the bedroom over maybe not naming explicit body parts, all the way up to erotica, right? And I think that's really, really important. Number one, if you're going to write a romance, to get clear with yourself about what your characters are demanding. You might have characters who have been traumatized and they are going to require a very different sort of scene than characters who are immersed in body positivity, right? You might have characters that it's both of their first times, or you might have a character for, he has been a playboy all his life, but this is the first person that matters. And so the emotional development, the sex scenes should change over the course of the story in terms of how the characters are with each other and the emotion they express and what happens afterward. But the level of quote unquote explicitness or spice, it's highly personal and it should be what is right for you and for the story.
Absolutely. And then that promise, and how you advertise that or how you find your readership should match.
Yeah. And it's the same with comp titles. I'm just going to use Lucy Score because a lot of people have read Lucy Score. So she does write really funny, some of her earlier books, like the Blue Moon series. I'm not talking about things we never got over, but some of her earlier ones, they're cute and adorable with, small town settings and goats that take bites out of people and whatever. But they're also pretty darn steamy. So if you are writing cozy small town, but your steam level is closed door, Lucy Score is probably not going to be a good combo. So that's the other thing that I encourage you to think about is when you're thinking about your comparable titles, which is important as an indie author as well as a trad author, and you're writing romance, think about the spice level when you're identifying those comparable titles. Because if you send to a fellow reader, this is the Lucy Score in the spice department, and then you deliver a closed door, the reader's going to feel cheated. And again, that contract is broken. So it's just a layered thing.
We'll be right back.
Is your podcast driving real results, or does it feel like a lot of effort with very little return? If you're a podcaster using your show to grow your business, then Podcasting Amplified is the podcast for you. You may have launched expecting listeners to flock in, but instead you're stuck on a handful of downloads while juggling recording, editing, promotion, and wondering what's missing. Well, Podcasting Amplified delivers no fluff episodes packed with real-world tips and strategies on positioning, recording, growth, and turning your podcast into something that actually supports your goals. So search Podcasting Amplified on your favorite podcast app today and start building a podcast that gets results.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm going to adopt this new euphemism. How do you like your eggs? I'm thinking about as you're explaining all these things. I'm like, oh, they like their eggs with hot sauce. And they like their, anyways.
They like their eggs over.
Yeah, exact. Over easy. I like it. Okay. So now that we've sort of set the stage, we know what we're talking about. We've brought the listeners up to speed. I mean, the whole concept and love that you pitched here that we were going to talk about is there's this misconception out there that romance is all too frequently dismissed as fluff, or that there's some shame involved in that genre and that it's not the same as literary or something else. And that's what we want to talk about here, because I think if you're listening to this podcast, you're in all likelihood really curious about it, or maybe you want to write romance and you're like, but is it quote, and I'm not saying this with judgment, but people say, is it real writing? Where does this come from? And what made you think of, like, why are we talking about this? Like, what's that?
Well, as a romance writer, I had a situation in college where I had the one and only writing seminar I ever took. And so her effects, it didn't stop me from becoming a writer. So you don't need an MFA or a BFA to become a writer. I believe that with all my heart. But I stumbled into a literary fiction seminar. And when we were asked to go around and say our 5 favorite writers, I have to say Anne Rice. Now, she's not a romance novelist, but there's a fermented.
Like commercial, yeah.
Very commercial, very genre focused. And the room felt dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Everyone around the table but me was smart enough to sleep slowly under their seats. I'm just like, what is the balance? What is the professor's staring. And I needed to be off for that. And for the whole, he said, Professor, I see. And for the whole rest of the semester, whenever anyone wrote anything that was deemed overly commercial, overly romantic, or overly paranormal, what do you think, Anne Rice? And he would stare at it. And it was incredibly belittling. And I came away with this realization that genre fiction in general was thought of by many to be lesser, as if the more something sold and the more commercial appeal, the less viability and legitimacy
Or value,
or value in the eyes of it. And that really troubled me to the point where I didn't write another word for 10 years.
Oh my goodness. I'm so keep going, but I'm so sorry that happened to you. And we're gonna dismiss all of these myths today, hopefully. And I'm glad that you've done the work and are sharing your experience with us, because that is a misconception out there. Because in reality, romance is one of the highest grossing genres, and
The highest grossing,
right?
And so, the reason I wanted to talk about this today is the little redemption story here. Okay, so in that same department at this little fancy university, was a tenured English professor, and she was also a romance. And she was tired of her romance novels being dismissed as fluff. And when people saw her romance novels but didn't know that she had this unliked professor, they made fun of her. They mocked her. They didn't know it was the same person. Then the tenured professor in the department, ultimate respect. She's like, it's all me. I am the same person. I am writing my romances with intellect, with humor, putting my, same intellect into this as I do into my work. Yet this identity is summarily dismissed, having nothing to do with the quality of the work, which is what it is. And so she decided to start her own small press to give other romance novelists that opportunity and to republish her own titles. Now, this is many years ago. The press is no longer active, but it was my first exposure to this true concept of how people treat romance novels as lesser on the heels of this other professor in the same department, having the exact opposite perspective. And it made me, as a book coach and writing instructor and editor, absolutely determined never to dismiss someone because of the genre that they write. And it also made me really curious about why people feel the need to do this. So romance in particular, because I'm a romance novelist and I write paranormal romance, romantic, contemporary, right? And so I think that one reason that people dismiss this is the idea of, well, we already know how the book is going to end. So at the beginning of this conversation, you talked about the HEA, the HFN, so we have a raptor.
Yes, spoiler alert, if you're picking up a romance, it will have one of those two endings, right?
And so there's this concept of like, well, this can't be real writing, because in real writing, you don't know where the plot's going to take you. So this is what anyone could write a romance if these beats, and then you die, right? And I would put this the hot take out there that I actually believe it's actually much harder to write an excellent and engaging romance.
I completely agree, but keep going. Yes.
Well, because of everything that we just said about the structure. Romance, more than any other genre I've ever read, is about or written, is about character growth. You need to make these characters immediately relatable, immediately identifiable, immediately someone can empathize with, even if you're villainizing them from the start. You need to make their character journey so compelling and their character so compelling, and the obstacles and stakes that get in their way to feel so authentic, so genuine, so real that you're going to buy into it. And that even though you know where this is going, you find yourself at this all is lost moment going, I don't possibly see how these two are going to get together. And moreover, you genuinely really care, because let's just say, for the purposes of this conversation, that it is, I call them H1 and H2. They can be any gender. Of course, you can have poly romances, but for the purposes of this, H1 and H2. Even if you don't have a dual POV romance, and that is very common to have, it is really about the fact that H1, something is missing in their lives when the book begins. H2, something is missing in their lives when the book begins. Which is the case in many, many genres. But in romance, the idea is, it's that cheesy line, you complete me. I know where you're going with that. But the idea is that only these two people can complete each other. And they have all of this work to do. And it is through their relationship with each other that their deepest wounds come to light and that they heal. So to create two characters that have to bounce off each other in that way, where you're introducing obstacles and stakes that feel so profoundly authentic, to then deliver this believable HEA or HFN is really, really hard.
It is to put your own stamp on it, and to make your book unique, given that you are following the, formula, for lack of a better description. You're following, and we know where it ends, and we can predict these things. And yet to make that unique is actually up to you, the writer, and it's hard.
It is. And, I think that another reason why this gets dismissed is that whether you're talking about romances that center the female character, or sometimes you talk about male romances, and that's another marginalized identity, there is in our existing culture an audacity of centering, let's just take female-centered romances for the purpose of this conversation, because we could go on and on about all the other identities. There is a tremendous audacity of saying, I'm centering this woman. She deserves to get what she wants. She deserves to ask for what she wants. She deserves emotional healing. She deserves the romantic interest in her life.
Go girl.
Her property, yeah, especially if that romantic interest happens to be a man, which of course does not have to be the case. But this idea of body positivity, healing, that you deserve to be loved, that you deserve to ask and what you want, and that you deserve more than anything else to have that happy ending and not to settle, I think makes romance. I have a coaching client who has coined the term, trademarked the term, romance is rebellious. And I thoroughly agree with her in that way. It is a rebellious thing to say that women or people with marginalized identities deserve that. It is 100% what should be centered. And in studying romance, if you look at dark romance in particular, there's a lot of themes that might be triggering, and I won't say aloud because it could be triggering for people, but there are a lot of themes that you would think, okay, perhaps people who have gone through those things might not wish to read about this because it's triggering. But I spent a lot of time talking to readers of dark romance who might have experienced some of those things, and they say, no, it's actually an act of reclamation, an act of empowerment. Because when XYZ happened to me, I didn't get that happy. But here on these pages, I can live it again, claim my power, and it turns out the way that I want it to in the end. I think also, in our brains, we have something called mirror neurons, where our neurons are literally mirroring experiences back to us from other people or to the world. There's been studies done that when people read romance in particular, that oxytocin activates in your brain. So you're actually feeling good, feeling better. And that when you're reading scenes that are reflecting kindness, compassion, people being treated well, happy endings, community, friendship, that those mirror neurons are also triggering, and the effect is that it is literally changing your neurochemistry in that moment for the better. Romance novels are used in trauma therapy now. So the concept that this is mere fluff, as you can tell, is something that really gets me going, because I truly believe that these novels, they're also a tool for community.
Yeah.
There's so many Discords and other places, Facebook groups, Instagram chats, where women and others have come together to support each other and talk about the stories. And so to me, it is such a force for good and positive change in the world that goes beyond just,
Yeah. I mean, you're actually talking my language here. We talk a lot about brain chemistry and readers' brains and how they work. And so thank you for bringing all of that to us. There's a huge need for positivity in the world. And like you said, it's not just reading a book, but there's a reason that these readers read a lot of it. But it has grown exponentially in the past decade. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I don't know whether you think it's, we now have ebooks. I started reading a lot more romance when I didn't have to carry a physical book around, and people would either know what I was while I was watching my children swimming lessons, or there's a sense, an element of privacy, but there's also this ability to publish more content and to have more information out in the world. Is there anything, any other reason why this genre has grown so quickly?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. I think that during the pandemic in particular, that's what we saw Henry come to the fore, Ali Hazelwood around that same time in general. But I think that people wanted something positive, a way to get out of their
Oh, and Hallmark just like movies, the Hallmark just let their Hallmark movies be running 24/7. And I was watching them with my children who can tell you when the all is lost moment comes and, oh, he's not going to be the hottie. I can tell you, like they're pretty well conditioned to the formula.
I mean, that's really telling though, right? It's like this fact when we are at our worst, when we are struggling the most, we want someone to, it's not just, oh, everything's going to be all right, pop up out of the head. It's, we're going to see these people struggle. We're going to see them go to their darkest places inside themselves. And then we are in this safe envelope where we know that it's going to work out at the end. So if there's no conflict, sometimes people think, well, there's no conflict. Romance is so filled with conflict, internal conflict, characters that work themselves, external conflict. No, I can't let you in this way because it's triggering whatever my deepest wound is, right? And so to vicariously experience that and in the end make everything work out okay, I think in our darkest times that is something that we need. And also I think with the rise in indie publishing becoming more and more accessible, and the fact that romance readers do read in series and, romanticities are longer, but romance, the tempered romance doesn't have to be that long. And so I think the doors that open for a lot of people who were avid readers for so long to want to tell their stories and to be able to do it outside of the realm of traditional publishing and to be able to speak to and connect with directly with readers. And I think that's another reason why we've seen the boom of it. And honestly, I think that's the strongest indication that there's demand for it because that's not true traditional publishers saying, we are presenting this data and say that you will like it. Some romance books are updated, of course, but it's readers speaking out directly. Indie authors, indie romance authors are only able to experience such wonderful success because readers are saying, please give us more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I wanted to circle back just on that thought about, yes, it is becoming more accessible and more people can be writing. And you're probably listening to this podcast interested in writing romance. And so I want to circle back to the fact that, yes, there are rules, there are formulas, but it actually makes it harder. I like to say that, I truly believe anybody can learn to write. You don't have to have an MFA. I don't have an MFA, and you don't have to have that education, but you do need to know that there are real and true skills to learn to affect your readers' brains to do this well. What are some of the techniques that you think are important, or even one that we could share with readers today that set romance or could create that important connection that we might not know if we're simply reading romance and then we sit down to write it? What's one thing that you could share, or more than one thing?
I would say it's character.
Yeah.
For all the reasons that I've said before. So let's just say that you have H1 and H2. You've got two large. When I'm writing romance, one of the very first things that I do is to really think, okay, what does this character want more than anything in the world? Why do they want this thing? What happens if they don't get this? I think that's your stakes, right? And then, all right, what is their essential wound? What happened to them ages ago? And now this thing, it's a flaw that's getting in their way everywhere they go at work, but they won't acknowledge it. They think everything's fine. You, the reader, are going to see it, right? And then, of course, what's their core misbelief? What do they believe as a result of this trauma and this flaw that they will die in that hill, man? They'll be like, this is the way the world is. For example, you can't trust anybody because everybody you love will always do you in. Right? And then, of course, what's the lesson they need to learn at the end? It should be the opposite of the core misbelief. So this works really well in romance. Your two main characters' goals are in conflict, and when their core misbeliefs are in conflict. So if you have one character who's like, okay, I believe that everybody I love will always leave me, and you have another main character who's like, it's always best to leave the situation first because when you get attached, you get hurt. And you put those two together, you're going to invariably wind up in a situation where one of them is going to leave the other one. And so one needs to learn, you got to stay to get the things you really want. The other needs to learn, you got to open your heart and trust that somebody will stay to actually be able to function in this world. And those flaws, they can't just show up in your romantic relationship. They've got to show up everywhere. So if it's everyone you love is going to lead you and then you can't trust anybody, you're going to see trust issues at work. This might be a character messaging everything themselves. The big event, the big wedding they're putting on, no, they got to manage the flowers. And of course, it's going to all fall apart. And so in the end, these characters will heal each other. And so That's the most important thing with writing romance is you're really thinking about who are these love interests? What are all the things that I just talked about? How can you create the greatest conflict between them? Because if their goals, wants, needs, flaws, core beliefs are not in conflict, then it doesn't. Like, we'll just think you've got Mel, for example, it's like a really black and white book. Like Ryan's character in the movie, she's opening up or she's maintaining her mom's little bookstore. And it's so important to her, not just because I run a bookstore, but because this is her mother's legacy. And she's employing people when she can. Here comes Tom Hanks' character, Box Books. Moves into the neighborhood, huge bookstore, like a Barnes and Noble, basically. Right away, we see the conflict. He's probably going to put her out of business.
Yeah.
And so this is the sort of thing where, of course, there's many other plot elements to it, but immediately these characters' goals are in conflict with each other. And so the other thing, that kind of goes along with that, with this character work, is you're thinking about, they still want to know about these characters. What subplot can I put in here? So when you've got Minnow, we've got the bookstore subplot, for example, the overarching romance plot. And that way, it's not just about the romance, but whatever that subplot is, it should be intimately related. You're choosing something that's going to showcase those flaws and wounds and core misbeliefs to their best capacity. And that way, the external and internal arcs are going to mirror each other.
Oh my gosh. I could talk to you about this all day, and we're going to have to have you back on the podcast. And my mind is just firing. If you're enjoying this conversation, put in the comments exactly what else we want to learn from Emily. And okay, we've reached the quick fire portion of this episode. And so here goes my questions. Your first book that you ever wrote, how long did it take you?
9 months.
9 months.
Ready. 3 months of revision.
A year. Amazing. Okay. What was your first big break?
That first book was a New York Times bestseller and a Target Emerging Authors book. So,
but how did it? What do you think that pushed it over the top? Just it was a great book, or what was the break that you got that helped you achieve that?
Okay, so I explained about my meeting professor, right? You totally put me up. I worked at a creative youth development program where I was surrounded by artists all the time and underserved youth that we were challenging to drum it out, paint it out, sing it out. But I was an arts administrator there. I wrote grants, I put on events, I did fundraising, all this stuff. And we were sitting in a meeting one day. And if you've ever tried to organize teaching artists and get them to fill out their timesheets, especially when they've had too much writing, it's like organizing Sunday kids. Like, you just can't. It's impossible. So I was like, I guess I won't try. At some point, I'll shut up, and then I can, So sitting next to our guitar teacher, she turned to me, she said, I'm so sorry. And I said, what are you for? You're so organized, you're this arts administrator. It must be so frustrating for you having to deal with us artists. Oh, you could persuade Davy
us artists making you othered, right? Yeah.
And it wasn't her intention to say, she would know, try it all. But I was like, okay, why don't you just stab me, please? Because I realized I was writing marketing copy. And I will say, all the years I spent writing newsletters, marketing copy, grants, all of that stuff proved to be so key when it came to writing, querying letters, all these things, all the spin that you put on.
And likely promoting your books as well, right?
Yes, it was incredibly helpful. So even if you had a completely unrelated career, I carried all of that forward. But my point is, I sat there, and as they continued to drunkenly battle amongst themselves, I was like, stop making me have the crap out. And I was like, I'm in. All around me are all of these kids that have been through such trauma. And I'm like, be creative, express yourself. But I won't even write my own book because this mean man, what? So I was like, all right, I'm going to build up my freelance editing career. And I'm going to give myself a year. I've done that. And if at the end of the year, I have amazing, I can do it. And if not, I believe in this career. I believe in this organization. And I will go back and I'm going to hate it. So I did all those things and I left and I sat down to write the book. And halfway into the book, I was like, I have no idea. I am totally stuck. And at that point, I was sitting in my office, typing, staring at one screen. And the mail came. And I was like, Blue's Clues. I jumped up and I was like, thank God, a distraction. It was a paper catalog for UCLA Creative Writers Extension, which is a huge online writing program. And I was flipping through it.
I love that it's an online writing program and a paper catalog arrive in the mail. But yes,
I know.
I know.
We're now talking about 2008 or
Yes.
My first book came out 22. So I'm looking through it because Alternative is staring on the screen. And there was a class for people who were halfway through their novel stuff.
Love it.
And it was $610. I was like, oh, it's not me because I got no money right now because I put everything into doing this. So sadly, put down my paper catalog. Sadly, went back to staring at the screen. Next day, Blue's Clues. Now call. Wow, distraction. Went. Envelope from mortgage company. I'm like, oh, what fresh hell is this? So I opened it up and it was a return on escrow for $610. And I was like,
Oh my gosh, I just got chilled.
so I was like, well, this is the sign. So I went ahead and class. The class was taught by a wonderful woman named Caroline Levitt, who wrote pictures of you and everything. And I went to the class and she went back to me and she's like, I'm so sorry. This is older. I love your stand, but I'd love to work with you. And I was like, I don't think I can afford that because I only have $610. And the next day she wrote back to me. She says, one spot. And so I took the class. At the end of the class, she was like, I'd like to mentor you privately. By that point, I took money, he had to mentor me, and then the book was finally done, revised, all the things. And she said, now you need to put together a list of agents. I said, but I don't know any agent that wasn't coming from a bookish community. I said, how many do I have to put together? She said, 75. I was like,
Oh my goodness. 75. Those were the days, right?
So I did this. It was getting rejected. And then there was one agent who said, this book needs, I love it, but it's not working. I was like, you? And she said, it needs a more integrated dramatic scaffolding. And I was like, I know if there's individual more to me, but together I don't understand. So I went back to Caroline and I was like, you've got to help me. She said, I love this book. And I said, well, that's nice for you. And so, but clearly something's wrong. But she said, give it back again. So she looked at it again, and it is sort of a dual timeline kind of story. Most of my computer. Anyway, she ended up changing something, but the timelines to her up in a different way. And she said, this is what I think will work. Part of me was like, oh, but the other part was that I've come so far. I've worked so hard.
Yeah. Sometimes you just have to do the work. If you could see the path,
yeah,
you got to do it because, hello, New York Times and USA Today bestsellers.
And I the book and he really printed out the scenes. I put it on the floor in tiles by POV and I physically rearranged those and never right. But I didn't know what else to do. Put it back together and I started querying it. And in 2 weeks I had 2 offers of rep.
And it was subtly clear. I love it.
Clear. And so that's the book that went on to the USA Today list. That's the book that went on Times list. That's the book that was targeted emerging authors pick. And people still write me about it. And I'll tell you during to this broadcast what they write me about it because it has to do with a man who promised his wife that he would come home from out climate change. He was a clever guy. He said, no matter what, I'll come back to you. And she desperately didn't want to do this particular trip. And this is not a spoiler. It's the very beginning. And he died in an avalanche. And to keep his promise to her, he manages to integrate himself into the memories of a man who's never met.
Oh my goodness.
He wakes from an accident, seeing a woman and a little boy in his body with no idea who they are, missing all of his own memories, having only somebody's stranger's memories, knowing that he needs only to find this woman he's in love with despite that. And so for me, when I wrote it, I was fascinated by the ghosty part, the climbing part. But almost all of the emails that I are about, I would have done anything to speak to the person that I loved again, especially when it was
a connection.
It's all about that love story and how it made people feel. There I was thinking, I'm being so cute. I just POV. No, nobody cares. This is why sometimes we read books where the craft isn't 100% necessarily spot on, but we can't stop throwing the pages. It's because the writer has made us feel. And that is the number one job of writing romance more than anything else. Make us feel, make us care. And that to me is what makes romance so special. Like in a world where how numb to so many things, where it hurts us sometimes to care, where it feels dangerous to care. Here is a safe space for with people going through difficult things who get their happy ending. And it shows us ways that we can ask for what we want in the world. It shows us that even though these are fictional heroines and heroes and everyone in between, that there can be that happy ending for us. That there is another way that these sorts of people might exist and that we don't have to sell. And that transformation extends beyond the romantic because we're talking about healing the whole character to every realm of life.
Oh my goodness, Emily, that was amazing. Okay, so you've got a new book coming out, which we talked about at the beginning. And so we will have all the links in the show notes, but can you tell us where to find you? Where can writers who are listening right now that want to find your services, your coaching services and other things, where can we find you?
So there's my website, emilycolin.com. All the ways to find me are there. In terms of social media, I am most often on Instagram, where you can find me at Emily Colin Books. I do have a reader group, the Shelf Care Queens, and I have a little strategic on Instagram as well. So I always love connecting with readers and love my little reader group and my street team chat. And we talk about things bookish, but we also support each other during difficult times. And I have a Discord too that you find your way into the ecosystem and you're more of a Discordy human, you can out there.
Oh my gosh, I am so convinced that every single writer listening to this is like right now is on. If you're on her website right now, then I am not surprised. Thank you so much for coming today, Emily. So blessed to be sharing this conference with you and to have this time to geek out about romance. I was already in the camp, but I'm sure that you've convinced a lot of other writers here today.
Well, it's truly my honor and my privilege. I'm so excited. I love talking with people about craft and talking with you in particular. That you're so enthusiastic and you're already a romance fan. So it's literally the best. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Show Don't Tell Writing Podcast with me, Suzy Vidori. It is my absolute honor to bring you the straight goods for that book you're writing or the book that you're planning to write. Please help me keep the podcast going by helping people find us. You can subscribe to the podcast and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you're listening to show how much you enjoy the show. That's how other listeners will find us. Also, visit suzyvidori.com/newsletter to hop on my weekly inspired writing newsletter list, where you'll stay inspired and be the first to know about all the upcoming training events and writing courses that happen in my community. Want my eyes on your writing? Submit a page of your current draft for a chance to come on the podcast at the link in the show notes. I'd love to chat with you about your writing in my always positive, incredibly supportive way so that you can make great strides towards your writing goals. I'm here to cheer you on. Remember, that book you're writing is going to open doors that you haven't even thought of yet, and I can't wait to help you make that it the absolute best it can be. See you again right here next week.